Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly, almost weightlessly, through corridors so ancient they hum with memory, so dark that the soft glow of a lantern feels like it might offend the walls themselves, and so still that even your own breath seems to echo louder than the Emperor's decree. And yes, you're here, not as a visiting dignitary, not as a wandering poet, but as something far more invisible and far more powerful. A palace eunuch, wearing velvet-bottomed slippers designed to silence every step, holding an iron ring heavy with keys that do not jingle unless you want them to, and wearing a long robe that brushes just above the polished floor as you glide past lattice windows, half-open scrolls, and the ever-listening hush of the Forbidden City. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing your sleepy corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move, not as a guest or nobleman, but as one of the countless figures who once served the emperor without ever truly being seen, whose name might never have made it into the official records, but whose daily life was spent moving through rooms that others were forbidden to even name aloud. And while you might imagine the life of a eunuch as one of dull servitude or monotonous routine, the truth, layered like the folds of silk you wear, is that these men often lived lives of extraordinary complexity, wielding influence in unexpected ways, all while remaining half shadow, half human to the world outside the red, lacquered gates. Velvet shoes, you see, weren't just a luxurious touch. They were a symbol of silent authority, a necessity in a world where the ability to overhear was sometimes more useful than the ability to speak. And that ring of keys in your hand, it's not just ceremonial, though the bronze glints in the lantern light might suggest it. Each one opens a room most people never enter, a chest most never touch, a scroll cabinet containing letters never sent, or a diary never meant to be read. And this, perhaps, is the secret that keeps you awake at night even after the incense has burned down to ash. That power in this world comes not from shouting orders, but from knowing who slipped in where, who said what after wine, and which official placed a letter beneath which door in the hour of the rat. The other servants bow slightly when you pass, not because they fear you, but because they don't know whether you might one day whisper their name in the wrong ear. And even the ministers, those men with their high hats and scholarly sighs, treat you with a mixture of disdain and nervous respect. For it was often eunuchs who ran the internal life of the palace, who selected the meal that would be served to the emperor that evening, who approved the concubine's visit, who delivered the brush and ink, and yes, sometimes it was a eunuch who recorded the emperor's dreams and what he muttered in his sleep. Now, as you stand in the shadow of a carved pillar shaped like a coiled dragon, one hand resting on the cool stone and the other gripping the smooth wooden edge of a diary you've carried tucked inside your sleeve, you wonder, perhaps not for the first time, why you write what you write, and who, if anyone, will ever read it. The diary is bound in paper, softened with rice water, its edges stained slightly with tea from the morning's spill, and the ink you used to write that last passage about the imperial dog chasing its own tail in the inner courtyard has already faded into a shade between grey and memory. Your fingers, stained faintly with ink and oil, turn to the first page, and you remember how you once wrote, "Today, His Majesty sneezed 3 times during the poetry reading," and then later added, in smaller script, he was not pleased with the 5th poem. He coughed deliberately during its final couplet. Harder, that entry, like so many others, wasn't meant for drama or for legacy. It was just the quiet act of someone trying to shape their own corner of an impossibly large world. Someone who had no family name to pass on, no children to inherit a surname, and no statue to be carved in their likeness, but still, somehow, needed to say, I was here. I noticed things. And I remembered. You write not for the historians, not for the bureaucrats, and certainly not for the emperor himself. Though sometimes you imagine he might discover your diary and be amused, even flattered, by your observation that he chews more on the right side of his mouth than the left. When eating candied lotus root, you write, really, for yourself, and perhaps for the echo of yourself you hope might outlast the scent of ink and incense, an echo that whispers in the margins of a world that never asked you to speak, but never quite managed to silence you either. There is a certain joy in noticing the smallest things, in recording the texture of plum blossom petals crushed under the emperor's shoe during the spring festival, or the sound of a minister's voice breaking when he knelt for too long in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And while historians still argue whether eunuchs were truly as powerful as the records suggest, or whether their influence was exaggerated by later dynasties, eager to blame their failings on the ever-scapegoated inner officials. The diaries, those fragile, hidden things, suggest a quieter kind of influence. The influence of those who remembered everything, because they were expected to forget. The lantern light flickers gently as you return the diary to your sleeve and begin your slow walk toward the hall of mental cultivation, where a new consort has taken up residence, and the emperor has recently begun sending midnight requests for almond milk and Tang Dynasty poetry recitations. And though your feet barely make a sound, and though your name may never be carved into stone, you walk with the unhurried grace of someone who knows that the secrets of the palace do not live in gold or jade, but in ink, in paper, and in memory. And somewhere behind you, in the darkened archives where dust dances like old spirits in the still air, a page waits to be read. The one where you wrote, in a tone halfway between amusement and melancholy, "Today, the emperor asked for a joke. I told him the story of the goose who learned to bow. He laughed until he cried. Or perhaps until he remembered how. You hear it long before it happens, that whispered conversation behind a heavy curtain, the one where 2 voices, too soft to identify and too urgent to ignore, debate the fate of a young boy from a distant province. A boy with large eyes and quiet steps, who, according to the eunuch registry scroll, matches the ideal height, weight, and temperament required for palace service. And though it all sounds impossibly abstract, like decisions made in thin air, The consequences are utterly corporeal, carved into flesh, and sewn into silence. And you begin to understand that behind every eunuch's diary, behind every ink-stained character and poetic aside, there lies a wound. Physical, yes, but also psychic. A wound that has never quite healed, no matter how many silks are layered over it, or how many perfumed scrolls are unrolled across the centuries. You remember your own journey, not because you want to, but because you must. Because that memory folds itself into every line you write, every gesture you perform in the emperor's presence, and even in the stillness of dawn, when the garden is hushed and the koi barely ripple the pond. You still carry the echo of that day, when your name ceased to mean what it once did. When your family, eyes red and proud, handed you over to destiny, cloaked as opportunity. And as your head was shaved and the ritual began, you recall watching a butterfly land on a nearby wooden screen, delicate, uninvited, and unaware that it had witnessed the moment your voice would never deepen, your body would never follow its natural arc, and your life would be defined not by who you were, but by what you were not. They say the ritual was clean, that the pain was swift, and that the herbs soaked in wine dulled the sensation. But no diary entry ever described it that way. Instead, the pages always refer to that day in veiled metaphors, in lines about crossing the cold river or the garden gate that never opens again. And you, like those who came before, learn to wrap trauma in language, to fold it inside a sentence and tuck it behind a smile. Because pain, in the palace, is like incense, omnipresent, lingering but never directly spoken of, unless one wishes to be replaced by someone younger, quieter, and more obedient. And yet, for all the cruelty of it, for all the irreversible finality of the knife and the basin and the red cord tied around trembling ankles, there is a strange irony at play. Because in surrendering the possibility of lineage, you are granted proximity to the very heart of power. You are allowed to walk beside emperors, to hear secrets never written down, and to serve not only as witness, but as participant in the most intimate, volatile theater of all, imperial life. And while historians still argue whether these boys were truly chosen for their purity of spirit, or simply for their physical harmlessness, the diaries suggest another possibility altogether. That these were boys who saw everything, remembered everything, and learned very early that silence could be a language more powerful than shouting. You think now of the boy you once knew, a boy named Lin, who arrived from a fishing village on the southern coast, with salt still lingering in his clothes and a voice like drifting fog, who wept not during the ritual itself, but afterward, when he realized he would never return home, never hold a child with his own eyes looking back at him, and never again be called son. In the voice of a mother who still thought he might become a merchant or a scholar or, heaven forbid, a farmer with a small boat and a loyal dog. Lin wrote poetry in the margins of old ledger scrolls, short verses that always ended with the same character, hui, meaning ash or return. And when he vanished one winter morning, his bed still warm and his slippers missing, you searched for his diary among the ashes of the laundry furnace, but found only a single torn page, reading, "Better to disappear than to dry and wrinkle in a corner." Sometimes, late at night, when the halls are still and even the wind seems to bow its head in reverence. You wonder whether Lin ever wrote again, whether he found a small village where no one asked questions, or whether he became another name on a scroll that no one reads. A ghost whose words were carried off by crows and scattered into the bamboo groves beyond the wall. And it is in those moments, with your fingers curled around a brush and your eyes adjusting to the dim glow of a single candle, that you commit another thought to paper. Not for the archives, not for the emperor, but for yourself. A line that says something like, "Today I served lotus soup to a man who believes he is a god." And I smiled the entire time. You write it not in anger, but in curiosity, in that soft wonder that never quite leaves you, even after all these years. Because life in the palace is nothing if not a slow unfolding of layered irony and constant performance. You've seen boys arrive full of fire, vowing to rise through the ranks and become the next head eunuch, only to wither beneath the weight of endless protocol and spiritual erosion, their ambition slowly dulled by the monotony of calligraphy practice, incense counting, and memorizing the exact temperature at which the emperor prefers his bathwater. And still, some make it, some rise, some carve out small realms of influence where they reign over who gets to enter, which room and when, who eats with porcelain bowls and who with wooden ones, and who, in the end, gets to serve the emperor his dream pillow. Yes, that's a real thing. And while the outside world might laugh at the idea of a man whose very identity was taken being trusted with so much ceremonial power, the truth is that eunuchs survived because they knew how to manage fragility, how to speak in tones softer than silk, and how to balance a scroll of delicate rice paper, even while the world around them burned with ambition and hidden knives. It's said, though no one admits it, that some emperors trusted their eunuchs more than their ministers, that they whispered secrets to them in the half-dark of sleepless nights, asked them questions no scholar dared answer, and sometimes, in their most human moments, cried into their robes, drunk on wine or grief or both, because who else could be trusted to hold such sorrow without writing it into law or turning it into political leverage? The diaries, when you read them carefully, confirm this not through confession, but through rhythm. Entries that pause, stutter, or break form entirely. Pages where the ink smudges more than usual, as though the hand that held the brush had hesitated, or trembled, or decided to leave certain things unspoken. That's the thing about these diaries. They tell you as much in their absences as in their words. And you, a careful reader and quieter writer, have learned to listen between the lines, to see the shape of the truth, not in its outline, but in its irasha. You begin to realize, as you walk with slow, practiced steps through the courtyards of the inner palace, that to be a eunuch is not merely to serve in silence or to perform duties with exacting discipline, but to become something far stranger and more liminal. A permanent observer, a living ornament within the imperial machine, a ghost with eyes wide open, always watching, always remembering, yet never asked to speak unless spoken to. And even then, only in measured phrases, wrapped in deference and humility, so perfectly performed that no one quite knows whether you are being honest or simply doing what you've always done. Surviving. Every morning, before the court wakes, you stand near the eastern veranda, your hands folded within your sleeves, eyes fixed not on the sunrise but on the positioning of the guards, the rhythm of footsteps, the freshness of the scrolls waiting to be delivered. Because all of these things tell stories, and stories, as you've learned, are currency in a world that trades more in implication than in silver or silk. And while most officials march past you as if you were furniture, a few, especially the older ones, nod almost imperceptibly, not because they respect you exactly, but because they know that you, like the stone lions at the gate, have been here longer than some ministers have held their positions. And you've seen more in a single month than most will ever confess in a lifetime. From the outer courtyards to the emperor's private study, eunuchs are everywhere and nowhere at once, flitting like shadows across lacquered floors, adjusting incense burners with graceful hands, refilling teacups without being asked, and observing conversations with the kind of attention only those with no official voice can afford to cultivate. And in those tiny movements, those acts that seem invisible to the casual eye, you are performing the most sacred duty of all, remembering without being remembered. One of the older eunuchs once told you, back when you were still learning how to tie your robe correctly and how to bow without letting your gaze rise, that the palace doesn't reward cleverness unless it's disguised as obedience, and that sometimes the best way to gain favor was not to speak well, but to be nearby when someone powerful needed a solution, and offer it gently, as though it had occurred to them first. And though historians still argue whether eunuchs manipulated emperors or simply served as convenient scapegoats for imperial dysfunction, the diaries, those delicate, whispering testaments, reveal something altogether different. A portrait of men who knew how to navigate a world of fragile egos and unstable favor without ever appearing to do anything at all. You read one such diary late last night, its binding frayed and its characters fading from black into a kind of softened dusk. And in its pages, the writer described, with disarming calm, how he spent 3 years learning the personal preferences of a certain Empress Dowager. Not just her tastes in tea and incense, but the exact order in which she preferred her daily greetings to arrive, the temperature at which she would accept medicinal soup, and the exact phrasing she favored when being complimented on her embroidery. And by mastering this knowledge, by filing it away, not in ledgers, but in memory, he ensured his safety, and more than that, his proximity to power, which in the palace is never guaranteed and always conditional. Your own experience has mirrored this in small ways. Like the time you noticed the Grand Secretary's tendency to tap his fingers on the third knuckle of his left hand whenever he was lying, or the way the Crown Prince, despite his formal education, stumbled over the same Confucian aphorism every time he attempted to recite it in front of his tutors. And rather than recording these things in your official report, you wrote them in your diary, not out of malice, but out of that strange compulsion to preserve detail for no one in particular, to hold on to things that might otherwise be lost in the daily tide of ritual and routine. Sometimes, when you reread your own older entries, you're startled by what you chose to record. Not the grand political decisions or the declarations from the throne, but the minute and seemingly irrelevant details. A concubine's sigh when she thought no one heard her, the way the emperor coughed just before laughing, the small smudge of ink left behind on a decree he signed in haste. And it's in these fragments that the palace becomes most human, most real, stripped of the gold and ceremony and reduced to a place where men and women live, breathe, and perform. You once wrote an entire entry about the way a cat, stray and unimpressed, marched across the hall of supreme harmony during a rehearsal for the mid-autumn ceremony, weaving its way between robed officials and yawning eunuchs as though it belonged more than any of them, and how no one dared chase it for fear of being seen as disrespectful toward a creature that had chosen to bless the hall with its indifference. And though that story never made its way into any official record, you still smile when you think of it, because it reminds you that even here in this place so obsessed with hierarchy and discipline, there is still space for the unpredictable, the absurd, the soft things that slip between protocol and leave behind traces of laughter. And so, each day you watch, not because you have to, but because you've trained yourself to. Because in a world where your value is measured by how invisible you can become, attention is your one weapon, your one thread of agency, and with every observation tucked carefully into the folds of your mind, you gain something, not control exactly, but certainty, the comfort of knowing that while others posture and proclaim, you see what truly is. Even the emperor himself, resplendent in robes embroidered with dragons and clouds, is not immune to your gaze. You've seen him glance nervously at the faces of his ministers when he stumbles over a line of poetry. You've noticed how his fingers tremble slightly before he signs a particularly harsh decree. And you've read the slight narrowing of his eyes when a visiting envoy bows a little too deeply. Small signs, barely perceptible, but recorded nonetheless. Not for betrayal, but for the quiet satisfaction of having seen what others missed. And though no one will ever ask you for these observations, though no minister will request your opinion in council or cite your words in policy debates, you write them anyway, in your small, steady hand, on pages that might one day be burned or forgotten or perhaps miraculously preserved in some dusty archive, waiting for a reader who understands what it means to live a life of total presence without recognition. You close your diary for the night, the pages warm beneath your fingers, and place it beneath your mat where it will be safe until morning. And as you lie down on the hard wooden board allotted to you, staring up at a ceiling painted long ago by someone whose name is also lost, you feel a strange peace settle over you. Not because you are content exactly, but because you know that in the grand, echoing silence of the palace, your thoughts, your observations, your invisible witnessing have become a kind of echo themselves, repeating softly through time. It begins with a scent, faint, warm, slightly bitter, the unmistakable aroma of sandalwood oil mixed with something older, something like dust soaked in memory. And as you slide open the delicate cabinet door in one of the lesser-used storerooms beneath a hall of benevolent tranquility, a small curl of incense ash flutters to the ground, disturbed by your presence after so many years of stillness. And there, wrapped carefully in silk embroidered, not with dragons or lotuses, but with a modest pattern of bamboo stalks and sparrows, lies the object you've been seeking since before dawn. A diary, bound not with leather or lacquered wood, like the ornate journals gifted to scholars, but with rough, hand-stitched paper that has yellowed around the edges and smells unmistakably like a season that never quite ended. You pull it from the stack with the same reverence you would afford an imperial edict, not because it contains the fate of a dynasty, but because you know, deeply, intimately, that within its fragile pages lies the shape of someone's vanished voice. A voice that once whispered to itself by candlelight, scribbled furiously under the mosquito netting, paused mid-sentence to glance toward the door, in fear or longing or both, and pressed ink to paper, not to be heard, but simply to feel a moment of control in a life dictated by shadows and ceremony. You recognize the handwriting immediately, even though the ink has faded into a soft gray, almost disappearing into the fibers of the page. Tiny, meticulous characters that bend slightly to the left, as though the writer was always half-glancing over his shoulder while writing, always worried about being interrupted, always balancing his brush just a little too tightly between nervous fingers. And though the name is never signed, not once in the entire diary, you know whose hand it was. Because style, in this case, is as telling as a fingerprint. He wrote with restraint, rarely using exclamation marks, avoiding flourishes, and yet the quietness of his prose only makes the emotion more visible. The tension between duty and fatigue, the careful way he describes folding the emperor's nightclothes or choosing the right tea leaves for a favored concubine's insomnia, all while slipping in the occasional observation that betrays something far more personal, like the way he always described the moon as lonely, or noted, with mechanical frequency, the precise moment a bird began to sing outside his chamber window each morning. You turn the pages gently, not wanting to disturb the thin paper more than necessary, and read one entry dated during the early days of spring, when the peach blossoms were just beginning to stir from sleep. And it begins plainly. Today, I arranged the calligraphy set on His Majesty's desk before sunrise. The inkstone was cracked. I replaced it before he noticed. Tss. It's a dry sentence, perhaps, to anyone else, but to you, it reads like an act of quiet heroism, of invisible caretaking that will never be thanked or acknowledged. And the very next line deepens that impression. He asked for the poem by Dufu. I knew which one. He didn't say the name. That is the essence of eunuch service. Not merely responding to commands, but anticipating them. Knowing a person's preferences so intimately that you cease to see them as requests and begin to treat them as inevitabilities. And in the space between being told and being needed, there is a kind of intimacy, a secret closeness that even the emperor's wives might envy. Because while they were chosen for beauty or political strategy, you were chosen because you understood the art of silence, of efficiency, of knowing how to disappear from a room, even while standing inside it. He goes on in that entry to describe the emperor's mood that morning. Distracted, slightly melancholic, possibly due to the coming rain. And then, in a sudden turn that feels almost too human to be recorded in such neat characters, adds, "I wished I could ask if he dreamt of his mother again, but of course I remained silent. I only poured the tea." You pause at that sentence, fingers resting on the edge of the page, because it captures something that official records never do. The emotional tension of proximity without connection, the strange ache of being close enough to observe someone's sadness, but too bound by protocol to offer anything resembling comfort. Later in the same diary, there is an entry with no date at all. Just a smeared brush mark at the top of the page and a single paragraph written in a slightly more hurried script. Sometimes, I imagine the ink is blood and the brush is a vein. And if I write enough, I might remember what it feels like to be human. You don't know if he meant it literally or poetically, or whether the thought had been haunting him for days, or simply drifted through him like a gust of wind in the middle of a sleepless night. But either way, it stays with you long after you've closed the diary and returned it to its wrapping, because it speaks to something that every eunuch, at one point or another, feels and dares not say. That the act of writing is often the last thread tethering them to a world that acknowledges their inner lives. Historians still argue whether eunuch diaries are reliable sources, whether they were exaggerated, sanitized, or simply fabrications meant to serve some later narrative. But the truth is, most of these journals were never meant to be read at all. Not by ministers, not by scholars, not even by fellow servants. They were confessions made to no one, and in that way, they are more honest than any court document or official chronicle could ever be, because they were not written to please or persuade, but to record, to remember, to survive. You return the diary to its place beneath the layers of silk, smoothing the cloth gently, as though putting a child to bed, and close the cabinet door with a soft click that seems to echo more loudly than you'd like. And as you walk away, back toward the hallway, where the breeze carries the faint scent of plum blossoms and someone's distant cough, you carry with you not just the words on those fragile pages, but the rhythm of the hand that wrote them, the quiet urgency, the breath between sentences, the weight of memory pressed into each line like a seal. And you think, not for the first time, that perhaps your own diary will one day be found like this, folded beneath a robe or hidden in a drawer, and that someone like you, years from now, will open it and read your handwriting and know, with a kind of quiet certainty, that you were not alone, that even in this world of cold floors, stiff protocol, and constant watching, there were those who chose to write, to record, to remember, even if no one ever asked them to. You push open a narrow wooden gate, its hinges oiled so regularly that it barely makes a sound, and step into the portion of the palace few ever get to see, unless they belong to the quiet class of servants who know how to navigate its paths with lowered eyes and careful footsteps. And as you move beneath the curved eaves and past a weather-worn bronze urn filled with rainwater and fallen petals, You realize you're walking into one of the most hidden and strangely intimate corners of court life. The inner court, a cloistered realm of women, whispers, incense smoke, and surprisingly, the men who had been reshaped to dwell among them without ever truly belonging. This is where the eunuchs lived when they were not rushing through ceremonial halls or attending the emperor's command. Within modest quarters, arranged in a pattern like a forgotten maze. Each room barely wide enough for a bed, a writing table, and a lacquered box of belongings. And yet, within these walls, unfolded the entire landscape of their interior lives. A territory as rich and strange as any military campaign or political council, except here the battles were fought not with swords or declarations, but with glances, gestures, and the quiet scratching of brushes on paper, long after curfew bells had faded into the dark. It's in these rooms, draped with thin mosquito nets and warmed by small clay braziers in winter, that the diaries were written, not during the bright hours of imperial spectacle, but in those stolen minutes before sleep, when the palace had grown still, when the fireflies blinked against the paper screens, and when the mind, no longer occupied with remembering the proper number of bows or the correct order of ceremonial incense, could turn inward and ask questions that had no official place within the day's structure. What will I become when no one needs me anymore? What do I miss that I was never allowed to have? You enter one of these rooms now, left unchanged, since the eunuch who occupied it died decades ago. His belongings kept as they were, perhaps out of respect, or more likely, because no one knew what to do with the fragments of a man who had no family, no descendants, and no heirs to claim his memory. There's a faint smell of camphor and dried plum, the kind of scent that settles permanently into wood and fabric, and on the low table, coated in a whisper-thin layer of dust, lies a diary, open to a page that catches your eye, not because of the words, but because of what's drawn beside them. A small ink sketch of a goldfish in a bowl, its tail trailing like smoke, and beneath it, a single sentence reads, "She told me the fish dreamed too." You pause there, fingers hovering just above the paper, as if the air might explain itself, and realize that this entry is one of many written in this room, this tiny, dim sanctuary where memory and imagination mingled freely in the dim hours after curfew. And you begin to piece together, from the pages scattered across the tabletop and the folded ones tucked into a box beneath the bed, that the eunuch who once lived here had formed a kind of secret friendship with one of the older concubines, a woman no longer in favor but not yet dismissed, and that their conversations, though always conducted with appropriate distance and protocol, had taken on the intimacy of shared exile. It's not entirely uncommon, these gentle, cautious connections that form between eunuchs and palace women, though they are rarely acknowledged, even less frequently written about, and almost never spoken of aloud. And yet, the diaries hint at them constantly. Moments when a tray of tea was delivered a few seconds too slowly, not out of negligence, but to allow for an extra breath of shared silence. Comments recorded that begin as observations but trail off into poetry. And in one memorable case, a diary you once read contained a page that had been entirely blacked out with ink, followed by a note in the margin. To preserve what was said, I had to erase it. Historians still argue whether these relationships were romantic in any sense, or whether they existed purely as acts of emotional survival in a world designed to isolate everyone except those at the very top of the hierarchy. And though the scholars lean heavily on records and socio-political analysis, you find that the Diaries offer something else. Something that doesn't resolve itself neatly into academic categories, but instead pulses quietly with the weight of real human longing, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but lingers in small details. The mention of a shared plum between bites of porridge, the recollection of a joke only two people understood, the entry that simply reads, "She looked sad today," and I could not ask why. And that perhaps is what you feel most strongly as you stand in this room now, reading the half-faded pages by the slanted light that filters through the bamboo blinds. The overwhelming presence of thoughts that had no audience, of feelings so gently recorded that even now they seem reluctant to be read, and of lives lived within such narrow confines that a single conversation could echo for weeks. A passing smile become the seed of an entire paragraph, and a farewell, always unspoken, left hovering in the ink like a ghost too polite to interrupt. You find one entry dated during a festival, likely the mid-autumn celebration, when lanterns would have floated across the palace ponds, and the cooks prepared mooncakes with egg yolks that glistened like coins. And the writer describes watching the reflection of a lantern flicker in the concubine's tea. She did not speak for a long time. I told her the tea was strong this year. She nodded and said, "Some years taste more like memory." I think I knew what she meant. You sit with that line for a moment, the way one might sit with a bell long after it's rung, letting the vibration settle into your bones, and wonder what else he never wrote. What silences pressed themselves into the spaces between his words, like petals dried between pages. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimes, marking the hour when the outer court begins its morning rituals. And you realize the light in the room has shifted subtly, not with the drama of sunrise, but with the slow, creeping certainty of another day beginning. And you close the diary gently, not because you're done reading, but because it feels like the respectful thing to do, like bowing slightly when leaving someone's presence, even if they are long gone. Before you go, you glance around the room one last time, at the carefully folded bedding, the chipped porcelain cup on the shelf, the spare pair of embroidered slippers tucked beside a bamboo mat, and you realize that everything here, everything in this quiet space, was once touched by a person who lived, who served, who watched, and who wrote. Not because he had an audience, but because he had a self he wished to preserve, even if only between the covers of a modest diary, stitched with thread that's fraying now, but still holding for just a little longer. You wake before the bell, as always, long before the copper clang of morning ritual stirs the rest of the palace into its quiet bustle. And while the sky beyond your lattice window remains the color of overripe plums, you light your oil lamp with practiced hands, shielding the flame from the morning breeze that slips beneath the door, and reach immediately, not for your robes, not for your shoes, but for the thin brush tucked neatly beside your diary, already anticipating the words that have been building quietly inside you through the course of the previous evening's tasks. During the silent serving of wine, during the folding of ceremonial linens, during that brief, strange moment when the emperor, half asleep and half whispering, asked you whether dreams could be remembered if one had no memory of falling asleep. The diaries of eunuchs, you've come to understand, are rarely written in the moments of leisure, because leisure in this world is a myth. No, they are written in moments stolen from sleep, in the slim, grayed-out hours when the body begs for rest, but the mind insists on anchoring itself to the day just past, to record not the large events, because those are for the scribes and historians, but the subtle undulations of service, the peculiar half-thoughts, the forgotten gestures, the nameless worries, and occasionally, the lines that reveal the loneliness behind even the most dutiful precision. You dip your brush and begin, not with the date, but with the sentence. He asked again for the black tea from Anhui, but drank only half. And as you write, you remember that moment vividly, the way the emperor cradled the cup as if unsure whether to sip or to think, his brow furrowed, not in annoyance, but in something else, fatigue perhaps, or memory. And though nothing came of it, no decree followed, no reprimand issued, it lingered with you for hours afterward. And now it pours out across the page, joined by another line, and then another, until the scent of ink becomes indistinguishable from the scent of morning. Most entries begin this way, anchored in the mundane, tethered to routine. And it's only as you reread them later that you notice the quiet shifts, the way one sentence tilts toward poetry, the way a gesture, seemingly insignificant, becomes a motif, repeated over weeks, even months. One eunuch you trained with years ago once told you that diary writing was less about confession and more about architecture, about building a life from small, exact stones fitted together, not to impress, but to endure. And as you continue to fill your pages, you find his metaphor truer with each passing day. Today, your entry shifts. After the line about the tea, you write. At midnight, a concubine passed me in the hallway. She wore no shoes, her eyes were rimmed with sleep, but she did not look at me. I heard her whisper something, perhaps to herself, perhaps not. And there it is, that familiar hinge upon which many entries turn. Not a statement, but a question, a puzzle that will never be solved, because so much of what happens here is too fragile to grasp, too shrouded in propriety to speak aloud, and yet too full of meaning to leave unrecorded. In the entries of your predecessors, those careful men whose diaries now rest hidden in drawers, beneath floorboards, between the pages of falsely innocuous manuals on court etiquette, you often read about similar moments. A minister dropping his chopsticks and cursing under his breath. A poem recited by a concubine during a storm that was never mentioned again. A bird that landed on the emperor's shoulder during a ritual and remained there, calmly, as if offering counsel. These are not the kinds of things that make it into edicts or royal histories, but they fill the diaries like water fills a pond. Not flashy, not dramatic, but necessary, life-giving, undeniable. And that is why you write. Not to make declarations, but to preserve atmosphere, to bottle silence, to trap hesitation between brush strokes, to ensure that when your body has returned to ash and your name has been folded into nothing, there will still exist some record, however faint, of the world you move through daily, with eyes wide and mouth mostly shut. The act of writing itself has become ritual. Each evening, after duties are concluded and the oil lamp lit, you sit on the same mat, facing the same chipped screen, painted with cranes and waves, and lay out your inkstone, your water jar, your brush, your diary. You grind the ink slowly, breathing evenly, listening for the sound of guards patrolling outside, for the sigh of your neighbor shifting in his sleep, and for the soft click of palace doors being shut one final time before night clamps down over the city like a velvet lid. Sometimes what you write seems too trivial to matter. The second bell rang late today, you might note. Or the chrysanthemum tea had an odd bitterness this time. And yet these entries, over time, begin to accumulate weight. Not because the events themselves change, but because you begin to see the rhythms, the patterns, the anomalies, and the slow, inevitable drift of people and policies and preferences. As if the diary were not a document, but a tide chart, mapping the strange, tidal fluctuations of imperial mood. There is also the question of privacy. You lock your diary, of course, not because you believe locks can truly protect anything in this place, but because the act of hiding is part of the ritual. An acknowledgement that the things you record are not meant to be seen, or at least not yet. Some eunuchs hide theirs beneath floorboards, others inside tea jars or old scroll containers. One man, long dead now, famously stitched his into the lining of his winter robe, claiming that the cold preserved ink better than heat. And you? You keep yours in a small compartment behind the altar, hidden behind an image of the medicine Buddha, trusting perhaps that even if someone finds it, they might think twice before disturbing the words that sit behind a god. Historians still argue whether these diaries were acts of resistance, tiny rebellions against a system that demanded silence, or whether they were simply coping mechanisms, ways to soothe a mind that had no other outlet, no family to confide in, no lover to speak to after dark. You think perhaps they are both, because in the act of writing, you reclaim something. Not your body, not your rank, but your narrative. You decide what is remembered. You choose the lens. You pause now, brush still in hand, and glance at the words you've just written. The page is almost full. A fresh pot of ink sits nearby. You consider beginning a new entry, one about the peculiar way the emperor kept humming the same melody all day. A tune from his childhood, perhaps, or one of those ancient court songs no longer in fashion. But instead you simply close the diary, press the cover gently with both palms, and let the ink dry in the dark, knowing that tomorrow will bring more things worth writing down, not because they are grand or historical, but because they happened. And you were there, and that, in this world, is enough. You don't mean to find it, not really. It's one of those moments where your hand slips between scrolls in the record room, where you're searching for an inventory list of ceremonial fans requested by the chief of the inner consort's household, when your fingers brush something different something slimmer and softer, its edges not wrapped in the usual imperial yellow, but in a faded cloth, the color of ash after rain, and as you draw it out, careful not to tear the brittle corner, you realize it isn't a government ledger or an official record at all. It's a diary, of course, but one unlike the others you've seen, because this one doesn't begin with dates or times or even personal reflections, but with something far more treacherous in its own quiet way. Gossip. Not loud gossip, not the kind traded in the kitchens between rice washing and pork steaming, but measured, meticulous, almost clerical gossip, written in a deliberate hand, with each name rendered in full courtesy title, and each rumor laid out as though part of an official memorandum. And as you flip through the pages, brows furrowed in disbelief and amusement, you begin to grasp the strange brilliance of the eunuch who wrote this. Someone who understood that knowledge, when preserved properly, could be sharper than any blade and more potent than any formal rank. The first entry simply reads, Lady Jen fainted today during the lotus-picking ceremony. Officially, heat stroke. Unofficially, she had heard she was to be passed over in favor of Lady Pink. The tea incident from last month likely contributed. Suspect? Xiao Yu? Motive, jealousy. Proof? None. Pattern? Repeating. It's not exactly poetry, not in the usual sense, but something about its structure, its efficiency, its almost pathological refusal to embellish, makes you laugh softly under your breath. Because in this palace, nothing ever just happens. And everyone has a theory for why everything happens the way it does. You read on, the pages flipping easily now, your breath matching the rhythm of the entries. Midnight, heard argument behind the Hall of Tranquil Harmony. Female voices, likely 2 senior ladies in waiting. Words indistinct. Caught air and remove in rapid succession. Will monitor. Or new eunuch assigned to incense rotation. Clumsy. Burned sandalwood too early. Empress frowned. That's all it takes. Each page is its own little performance. Not of facts exactly, but of attention. The kind of attention cultivated only by those who are rarely seen, but always seeing. By those trained to observe without interfering, to record without consequence, and to remember without reward. The writer of this diary, whoever he was, had clearly decided that the palace itself was the performance, that the true artistry lay not in calligraphy or etiquette, but in interpreting the unsaid, the partially seen, the almost overheard. You start to notice patterns, recurring names, whispered power shifts, phrases that hint at things more dangerous than bruised egos or stolen hairpins. One recurring figure, Lady Q, appears in several entries, with a kind of repetition that suggests orbiting scandal. Lady Q received 3 gifts this week. One was a bolt of northern silk, unusual, no record of request, origin unclear. Then a few pages later, Lady Q seen walking alone with Physician Shen. Twice, once near the chrysanthemum pond, once at dawn. Neither was scheduled. And finally, Lady Q moved to southern apartments, claimed air was better. Possible cover, no further sightings. For now. You're not sure if the diary's author ever intended to act on this information, or if the act of writing it down was itself the only move he was ever planning to make. but you understand instinctively why he did it, why it mattered. Because in this world, where words spoken aloud could lead to demotion, exile, or worse, to write something down in private was a kind of controlled release, a way of saying, I know, even if I'll never say it aloud. And you recognize something deeper too, something that resonates in your own experience. The pleasure of recording a world that pretends to be perfect while being anything but. It's not cruel, this diary. It doesn't gloat or accuse. It simply observes, faithfully, like a court painter assigned to sketch every crack in the porcelain and every stain in the silk, not because he wishes to shame the subject, but because the cracks are the story. And to omit them would be to lie. Historians, of course, rarely find these kinds of records, and when they do, they usually dismiss them as anecdotal, subjective, unreliable, tainted by personal bias or petty ambition. But they forget that all records are subjective, even imperial ones, and that sometimes the most honest version of history is the one written by the people too far down the ladder to benefit from lies. You think back to something one of the senior eunuchs once told you, long ago, when he was still new to the palace and full of the kind of cautious hope that hadn't yet been worn thin by repetition and protocol. Everyone in the Forbidden City is playing a game. Some play with jade tokens. Some play with ink. At the time, you hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now, as you flip to the back of the gossip ledger and read the final entry, wind came in from the west today, smelled like snow, someone's mood shifted, I don't know whose yet. I'll know tomorrow. You understand completely, because to write this kind of diary is to engage in a game of your own, a game of pattern recognition, of soft speculation, of connecting dots that might never appear on an official map. It's not about being right. It's about being attentive. And in the palace, that skill can be more powerful than rank, more lasting than favor, and far more satisfying than revenge. You wrap the diary back in its cloth, return it carefully to the gap where you found it, and brush your fingers over the surrounding scrolls as if offering them a warning, because now that you've read those entries, you see the whole palace a little differently. Every glance feels loaded. Every silence hums. Every accidental meeting in the corridor between rival factions becomes a note waiting to be written, and you realize, with a quiet smile, that tonight, when your duties are done and your room once again filled with the familiar scent of oil and rice paper, you'll be writing more than just your usual reflections. You'll be writing your own ledger of murmurs, not to spread, not to threaten, but to preserve, to remember, to quietly acknowledge that even in a palace built on appearances, someone was paying attention. The entry starts simply, almost innocently. Just a line in the margin of a diary, written in a slightly crooked hand, probably added hastily before the oil lamp ran out or a guard's footsteps passed too close to the door. The emperor farted again during the memorial service. And with that one irreverent, half-laughed sentence, you're reminded, sharply, vividly, that even the Son of Heaven, clad in gold-threaded robes and flanked by bowing ministers, is still, at the end of the day, a man with a digestive tract and a tendency to eat too many lychees when anxious. This is not the only entry like that, not by far. Once you start noticing them, you begin to understand that for all their elegance and grace, eunuch diaries are laced with a kind of dry, unspoken comedy, a gentle absurdity that floats just beneath the formality, emerging in comments that no one would ever dare voice aloud, yet somehow become necessary to record, not out of rebellion or disrespect, but as a strange sort of comfort, a reminder that the structure of the palace, so rigid and fearsome in daylight, occasionally wobbles on its foundations just slightly, just enough to let a chuckle slip through. You remember one particularly artful passage from a diary, copied secretly into a medical notebook by a junior eunuch, whose primary duty had been to monitor the emperor's meals and note his reactions afterward, and whose observations, though medically framed, drifted unmistakably into comedy. After consuming 3 bowls of goosefoot congee and a sour plum, His Majesty paused in contemplation. Then he belched so loudly that the ivory bell in the corner shook. He asked if anyone else had heard it. No one responded. I wrote this down. It's written without embellishment, almost with clinical detachment, and yet you can practically hear the suppressed laughter that must have followed, the rapid downward glances, the attempt to remain stoic, while one's ruler engages in the most human of disturbances. You don't laugh aloud, of course. There are ears everywhere, and some things, even when funny, must remain quietly funny. But you smile, and that smile lingers as you go about your duties, because there's something liberating in the knowledge that even the highest figure in the land cannot fully control his own body, that beneath the layers of jade, behind the perfumed silks and embroidered dragons, beats a heart, goggles a stomach, and sometimes slips out a sound that no ceremony can disguise. The entries go further than mere flatulence, though that does seem to be a recurring theme. There are notes about snoring, particularly loud yawns during early morning recitations, and one entry, forever burned into your memory, that recounts how the emperor once fell asleep mid-sentence while dictating a poem and continued muttering nonsense syllables that his frightened scribes nevertheless recorded word for word, until his head jerked awake, and he demanded to know what fish cloud thunder, apricot scream was supposed to mean. You wonder sometimes whether the emperor knew, whether he suspected that his every misstep and bodily function was being quietly documented by the men closest to him, not his ministers or his generals, but his servants, his eunuchs, the ones who waited outside the door while he bathed, who held his robe while he dressed, who delivered his food, measured his pulse, monitored his dreams, and whether he ever felt the weight of that silent record pressing around him like an invisible scroll, wrapping tighter with each passing year. Historians often paint these moments as signs of decline, as evidence of the weakening of imperial dignity or the crumbling of court decorum. But you, having lived within these walls, know better. You know that these moments were not failures. They were life. They were texture. They were the proof that the emperor was real, not just a symbol or a god carved in flesh, but a person who sneezed during incense readings and spilled ink on his robes and once tripped over a palace dog named Lian Lian while chasing a paper kite blown off the veranda. There's a famous passage So famous, it has been passed from eunuch to eunuch like a charm that appears in several copied diaries, always slightly altered, always beloved. His Majesty said today, "Bring me the little cakes, not the ones with the melon, the ones with the sesame that make less noise when I chew." I nearly asked, "Noise to whom?" but swallowed the question as I have swallowed so many. That line, "Noise to whom?" echoes in your mind even now, because it captures the palace's eternal paradox. Everything is performed, everything is watched, and yet everyone pretends otherwise. There is something oddly beautiful in that contradiction, something deeply human in the way everyone, from the emperor to the lowliest chamber pot scrubber, moves through layers of awareness, knowing that they are seen, pretending that they are not, and occasionally breaking the illusion with a sigh, a cough, or yes, a well-timed and poorly muffled bodily noise. And so the eunuchs write, not just because they can, but because it is their only act of quiet honesty in a world built entirely on presentation. And while some of their entries are grave, philosophical, or even poetic, others are simply real. Little windows into the absurdity of perfection, cracks in the marble facade where life seeps in like moss after a rain. You remember once, long ago, you were delivering tea to the Imperial Library when you caught the old archivist giggling behind a scroll. When pressed, he revealed the source. A line from a banned novel describing an emperor who insisted on wearing silk slippers that squeaked loudly just so his ministers would hear him coming and stop gossiping. "It's satire," the archivist had whispered, "but it's also just true enough." And then he'd looked over both shoulders and gone back to sorting records as if nothing had happened. Your own diary entries, when you look back at them now, are peppered with similar moments. Observations too small for history, but too delicious to forget. The royal parrot imitated the chancellor's snore today, a little too accurately. Everyone pretended not to notice. Or the Minister of Rights sneezed into his sleeve, then tried to pass it off as a bow. Points for creativity. These are the crumbs of life, and you gather them as faithfully as any chronicler collecting dates and decrees, because they matter. Not because they change the fate of dynasties, but because they remind you that fate, like wind, often shifts when someone hiccups. As you finish your latest entry, something about the emperor mispronouncing a temple name and blaming it on the humidity, you blow gently on the ink and close the diary with a satisfied nod, knowing that no one may ever read it, that no official archivist will catalogue these pages, that your lines might one day be burned with your robes or buried in lime with your bedding, but that tonight you have once again carved a small truth out of the grand illusion, and somehow that is enough. You sit cross-legged on the worn reed mat, the brush poised between your fingers with the careful grip of someone who's held more memories than possessions. And before you press it to paper, you stare for a moment at the small ceramic bowl of ink beside you, its surface reflecting the flicker of the oil lamp like a ripple suspended in time. And you think, not for the first time, how strange it is that so much power, So much preservation and so much personal freedom has been distilled into this simple ritual. The act of writing with a little brush, dipped in soot and water. Calligraphy in the palace is more than art. It is a form of self-containment, a practice both sacred and subversive, a discipline that outwardly serves to mirror the structure of the universe, order, balance, rhythm, but inwardly becomes a kind of escape, a place where a eunuch's voice can exist freely, line by line, without fear of being interrupted, corrected, or silenced. You were taught early that one's brushstrokes revealed the soul, and you believed it, because the older eunuchs all told you the same story, that even if you were forbidden from raising your voice, your handwriting would one day speak louder than anything you could have said aloud. And it's true. The palace values beautiful calligraphy with a reverence just shy of religious devotion. The emperor himself inspects it during festivals. Scholars earn appointments based on it. Walls are adorned with scrolls praising discipline and virtue, all judged by the fluidity of ink on rice paper. But among the eunuchs, calligraphy takes on another role entirely. It is both shield and sword, a way to encode emotions into form, to disguise critique as poetry, to offer observations so elegantly shaped that even their targets must pause to admire them. The diaries themselves reflect this tension. You've read ones where the strokes are rigid, painfully careful, betraying the writer's fear of punishment, of being discovered, of the terrifying possibility that someone might actually read what had been written. Others, bolder ones, flow with the confidence of someone who has already accepted that they have nothing left to lose. One, written in a style so loose it bordered on messy, simply declared mid-page. Today I decided to write with my left hand. No one told me not to. It felt like freedom. You remember your own training vividly, how the instructor corrected your angle of wrist, the pressure of the brush, even the rhythm of your breath, and how you spent hours copying the same proverb over and over. Stillness reveals truth. Motion clouds the water. And perhaps it was during those sessions, hunched over paper until your spine ached and your hand cramped, that you began to understand the deeper truth buried in those words. That in stillness, in silence, in observation, in the quiet labor of ink, you could carve out a space to exist, even in a world that tried daily to shrink you into obedience. Not all eunuchs write the same way. Some follow the old clerical script with its squared shapes and deliberate pace. Others prefer the flowing curves of running script, quick and spontaneous, almost like a whisper, rushing ahead of thought. There are those who hide messages in acrostics, others who tuck little jokes into the margins, and one infamous example who wrote his entire diary as a dialogue between his present self and the boy he once was. Each page a conversation between memory and resignation. Historians still debate whether these stylistic choices held political meaning. Was a sharply angular character meant as protest? Did loose strokes suggest madness or merely fatigue? Was that blot accidental or symbolic? But you, having spent a lifetime inside these walls, know better than to reduce ink to theory. You know that sometimes a blot is just a blot, the mark of a sneeze or a sudden noise that startled the brush. And other times it's more deliberate. A pause, a sigh, a moment of rage or tenderness, too strong for words, expressed instead as a bleed of black into the white. And yet, the palace teaches that nothing is meaningless. Everything here is read. Everything is judged. Even the emperor's dreams, when recorded, are first written in flawless calligraphy before being interpreted by astrologers, scholars, and the occasional charlatan, all arguing over whether the shape of a dragon in his subconscious implies prosperity or rebellion. So it's no surprise that eunuchs, surrounded by such scrutiny, have learned to write not only well, but wisely, to say things without saying them, to leave truths in the curve of a stroke rather than the structure of a sentence. You think now of a passage in a diary left behind by a eunuch named Chung, who served 3 emperors and died peacefully in his chamber at the age of 78. His diary spanned decades, hundreds of pages, but one entry near the end stands out. My brush today feels tired. I wonder if it remembers better days, or if that is only me, pouring memory into bristles. Either way, the strokes are crooked, but the truth remains straight. That line stays with you, particularly now as your own hand begins to tremble slightly with age, and you wonder how long you'll be able to keep writing, how long your words will continue to flow like a river refusing to freeze. Even the tools themselves carry meaning. Your inkstone was passed down to you by a friend who disappeared during one of the quieter purges, a man who used to hum old opera tunes under his breath when no one was listening. Your brush was made by a cousin who lives far from the capital and has no idea what you've become. And the paper, the paper, is handmade, smooth, but with just enough texture to remind you that nothing here is too polished, that even beauty is laced with flaw. Tonight you've written 5 entries, one after another, the brush gliding with ease despite the flickering light. One is about the new concubine who walks too fast for tradition. Another describes the sound of rain falling on the bronze bells outside the Hall of Literary Grace. A third simply reads, "There was a silence today that I didn't know how to name. It stayed with me like a scent." And as you reach the bottom of the last page, you hesitate, not because you've run out of things to say, but because you're unsure whether the next words belong on paper or if they're meant only for the space between thoughts. Finally, you write, "If I die tomorrow, let the last thing they read be in my own hand." You don't know why exactly. You don't plan to die. But in this place, no one ever plans to. Life here is long and short, full and empty, beautiful and unbearable, all at once. And sometimes the only thing you can trust to outlive you is your brushstroke. So you close the diary, press the palm of your hand gently over the soft paper, and bow your head. Not in prayer, not in farewell, but in gratitude. For the ink, for the paper, for the fact that here and now, with no one else watching, you can still choose how your story is written. You hesitate the moment you unfold the page. Not because it is stained or torn or brittle with age, but because the handwriting is different from what you expected. More fluid, more open, with the occasional dramatic curve on certain characters. The kind of embellishment that suggests either careless confidence or a moment of vulnerability too strong to disguise. And as your eyes move over the lines, you quickly realize this is not a diary meant to list events or observations, not one that details the emperor's meals or catalogues a minister's poor posture. No, this one is different, because this one begins not with a statement, but with a question. If no one knows your name, can you still fall in love? You sit back, fingers brushing the edge of the old page, and allow the question to settle into your chest, like the weight of a soft blanket, warm but heavy nonetheless. And before you read further, you understand, perhaps even before the brushstrokes confirm it, that what you hold is not just a record, but something deeper, something that straddles the line between memory and longing, between secrecy and confession, between duty and desire. It is unmistakably a love letter, or rather, it is a series of them, unsent, unaddressed, folded into the diary like dried petals between chapters of an unfinishable book, each one written as if meant for someone who once stood very close and now stands very far. Someone whose name is never used, only implied in the way the writer lingers over the shape of moments. Shared glances, hands brushing over a teacup, the soft scrape of slippers down a corridor long after curfew. And what surprises you most is not the content, but the tone. Gentle, deliberate, restrained. Not the cries of a heart in torment, but the reflections of someone who has accepted their place in silence and still insists on loving anyway. One line reads, "I saw you today across the courtyard where the peonies had begun to open. You didn't see me. You never do. But I knew you were humming again. The same tune, it clings to the stones after you leave." Another, even more startling in its simplicity, simply says, "I fixed your sandal strap. You never asked me to. I just couldn't watch you trip again." And though you've lived long enough within these walls to know that such attachments are dangerous, if not forbidden outright, you cannot help but feel something tighten in your throat as you read. Something tender and painful and old, like the sudden memory of a dream you'd once tried to forget. There are many scholarly arguments about eunuchs and love, whether it was possible, whether it happened, whether it should be included in the study of palace life at all. But those arguments always circle around theory, around dignity, around the architecture of roles and limitations, while this diary, and the others like it, if one dares to look, quietly prove what should already be obvious, that the capacity for affection does not reside in the body, or in what was taken from it, but in the mind, in the heart, in the space where a single word or gesture becomes enough to sustain a soul for weeks. And as you turn the pages, you find that this unnamed figure, this subject of quiet devotion, is not described in grand detail. Not once is their hair length or eye color mentioned, because that's not the point. The love that breathes through these entries isn't rooted in the physical or the carnal, but in the repeated observation of small things. How the person tilts their head when confused, the way they press their thumb against the edge of a bowl before lifting it, how they always pause 3 steps before a doorway, as if gathering breath before entering. These fragments are sacred in their specificity, not because they were meant to be admired, but because they were noticed. You pause now, closing the diary softly, fingers resting atop the cover, and you think about how many other entries, hidden in forgotten boxes or tucked behind old scrolls, might carry similar weight. Diaries not of service or protocol or observation, but of feeling, restrained and masked, and written only when it could no longer be held back. And you wonder how many of these voices were never heard, how many were burned or torn or buried beneath the feet of history, because no one thought the love of a eunuch mattered enough to preserve. But here, at least in this room with this page, it does. You reopen the diary and find one passage, dated on the eve of a festival, when the palace would have been lit with paper lanterns and the courtyards echoing with the laughter of favored concubines. And yet, the tone is unmistakably lonely. They danced tonight. I stood in the doorway with the others and applauded like I was meant to. But afterward, I returned to my quarters and wrote your name on the back of my hand in water. It disappeared quickly. Still, it felt like something. The poetry is fragile, maybe even a little clumsy, but it stays with you. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is true. Because anyone who has loved without permission knows the ache of such small rituals, the quiet desperation to find an outlet that won't betray you, to write someone's name in a way that cannot be punished, even if it also cannot be remembered. Historians still argue whether such feelings were mutual, whether palace affection ever crossed from the silent to the shared, and perhaps they always will. But the diary doesn't seem to care. It isn't asking to be justified. It isn't defending itself. It is simply saying, I felt this. I needed to say it somewhere. And that alone makes it more honest than most of the court records combined. You reach the last entry in this small, lovesick volume, and it reads like a sigh. You asked me for a cup of tea today. I think it meant nothing to you. But to me, it was everything. I made it perfectly. Of course I did. I always will. And as you close the diary, wrap it back in its faded cloth, and return it to its resting place behind the screen, you carry with you a weight that is not sorrow exactly, nor pity, nor even empathy, but something more complex, a kind of soft reverence for the courage it took to feel deeply in a world designed to flatten emotion into protocol. You step outside, into the night air that smells faintly of pine ash and distant flowers, and you look up at the pale moon that hangs over the tiled rooftops, like an old coin left forgotten in a drawer. And you imagine that somewhere, centuries ago, the person who inspired those diary entries also stood under this same moon, entirely unaware that they had been loved so carefully, so silently, so completely, that even their most forgettable requests were preserved in ink by a man whose name might never be known, but whose heart remains steady and unashamed across these fading pages. You follow the path toward the small side courtyard behind the Hall of Whispering Blossoms, a place almost forgotten by the palace staff, where moss creeps over the stone benches and the plum trees lean lazily across the crooked walls, as if even the trees have learned to eavesdrop here. And as you move through the stillness, brushing past a curtain of bamboo fronds and the gentle flicker of late summer insects, You arrive at a space that eunuchs of earlier generations once tended with unexpected care. The garden, modest in size, hidden from the grand avenues of imperial procession, but full of the kind of quiet thoughtfulness that no ceremony could replicate. They called it the eunuch's garden. Not because it belonged to anyone, it never officially did, but because it was only eunuchs who came here. Only eunuchs who cultivated the jasmine by hand and pruned the tea bushes with more attention than the imperial gardeners gave the rose arbor by the consort pavilions. Only eunuchs who sat beneath the crooked apricot tree and stared out across the stone path in silence, not meditating, not praying, but simply existing in a way that was neither decorative nor deferential, which, in the architecture of the Forbidden City, was already a small rebellion. This garden appears in dozens of diaries, and each one describes it differently. Some focus on the way the plum blossoms fell in spirals, others on the stone lantern that always leaned just slightly to the left. And one particularly poetic writer called it a place where the palace forgets to remember itself. You like that phrasing? You've written it down yourself once or twice, not out of vanity, but because it fits. The garden is a pocket of imperfection, a place without strict purpose where nothing happens exactly on schedule. And perhaps that is why so many eunuchs came here to write, and write they did. You find the proof tucked into the low, flat stones used as makeshift writing tables, in the hollowed-out sections of the bamboo fence where paper scraps were once hidden, and in the oil-stained benches where brushstrokes still faintly marked the wood, as if memory itself had taken root in the grain. One diary, particularly worn and water-stained, was written almost entirely in this space, with each entry beginning with an observation of the garden's mood. The wind is too warm today. Even the koi seem irritated, or the ginkgo dropped a leaf on my head. I took it as a blessing, but the garden was more than a retreat. It was also a mirror. In its soil, eunuchs saw themselves, pruned, contained, shaped by external hands, yet still alive, still growing in strange and unexpected directions. One writer observed, not without irony, that Amar's the tea bushes thrive more when ignored. I wonder if I do as well. Another simply wrote, "The jasmine blooms without audience," and yet another, clearly grappling with the contradictions of his role, mused, "I am tended like the bamboo, bent but not allowed to break." You sit now beneath that same crooked apricot tree, its bark cool against your shoulder, and open your own diary, letting the smell of earth and crushed mint fill your nose as your brush hovers over the first blank line of the day. It's not an eventful morning. You served the usual tea, adjusted the drapery in the throne room, and stood for 47 minutes, while the Minister of Rites recited a poem that rhymed too neatly to be sincere. But none of that makes it into your entry. Instead, you write, "The garden is still here. So am I. The plum tree, I think, remembers me." You don't need to explain it. The act of writing here is enough. It affirms that you've lived another day, observed another sliver of beauty, and added a quiet line to a long chain of other quiet lines, stretching back generations, like roots beneath the stone paths. There are stories, too, that live in the garden, not written in ink, but passed down in whispers during laundry duty or water carrying, of the eunuch who taught a sparrow to perch on his finger every morning, of the one who buried his last letter to his family beneath the moss near the western wall, of the man who came here every dusk to speak aloud to a lover long since married off to a merchant's son. Historians still argue whether these stories are true or simply palace folklore. But you've seen enough footprints, enough hollowed bamboo, enough smooth stones to believe that, whether true or invented, they are still real. Because what matters in the end is that someone cared enough to tell them, to repeat them, to keep them alive like a candle sheltered from the wind. One diary, now preserved in the archive behind the Hall of Sealed Knowledge, tells the story of a retired eunuch named Dai, who planted a single gourd vine in a corner of the garden, tended it for 4 years, then harvested its dried husk and carved it into a container for ink. He used it for the remainder of his life, and when he died, they found the gourd still half full, the ink inside untouched, but the gourd itself covered in his own brushwork. Proverbs, fragments of poems, and in one corner, a single question scratched with the point of a worn hairpin. If no one remembers me, will the gourd? You often think about that. The gourd, the ink, the strange, beautiful urgency to leave something behind, even if that something is hidden in the hollow of a fruit. And as you watch a breeze ripple across the tea bushes and scatter a handful of plum blossoms across the path, like careless confetti, you find yourself whispering aloud, not loudly, not to anyone in particular. I remember you, Dai. And in that moment, something like warmth pools in your chest. Not joy exactly, but the calm that comes from knowing a name has been spoken again, however softly. You rise slowly, knees stiff, brush still in hand, and walk along the outer edge of the garden, where the stone path leads to a small alcove, barely large enough for a man to sit, but just large enough to write. And there, tucked behind the frame of the stone lantern, you slide a folded page from your robe. Today's entry, written in advance in case the day becomes too busy, too loud, too political to finish later. You hide it there, as others have before you. Not because you fear it being found, but because it feels right to leave a part of your thoughts in the garden. A piece of yourself rooted in a space that asks nothing and accepts everything. As you step away, the wind shifts. A leaf lands gently on your shoulder, stays for a heartbeat, then falls. You let it go. It always begins with a sound. Not loud, not jarring, but persistent. The kind of noise that refuses to be ignored, even though you try, at first dismissing it as the wind brushing against a loose screen or the distant clatter of a dropped bowl in the servants' quarters. Yet as you pause mid-step in the hallway, leading toward the northern pavilion, you realize it isn't just a sound. It's a rhythm, uneven and sudden, sharp against the silence of night. A dog barking. A dog barking here in the palace? You stop completely now, your heart fluttering, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that barking at this hour and within these walls is not merely a curiosity. It is a breach. It means someone or something has strayed from the carefully arranged structure of routine. That order has been disturbed. And in the Forbidden City, even the smallest rupture sends ripples that can stretch across titles, fates, and days. Dogs are not uncommon in the outer compounds, used for hunting, for guarding, sometimes even as gifts from visiting dignitaries. But within the inner court, where the emperor sleeps and dreams, and where silence is the sacred rhythm of protocol, a barking dog is not just unwanted. It is suspicious. It is dangerous. And every eunuch knows that when a dog barks at night, someone, somewhere, will be blamed. You remember stories from your earliest days of training, whispered by older eunuchs with breath like old rice wine and eyes that darted toward corners even when no one was near. Stories of dogs barking on the eve of a scandal, of dogs growling outside the quarters of ministers who would soon be exiled, of one dog that reportedly howled 3 times before a concubine was found missing, discovered 2 weeks later in a well, her shoes neatly folded beside her. Dogs don't lie, the old eunuchs used to say, but they don't explain either. Tonight's bark is short, clipped, followed by silence. Then another, closer. You grip your sleeves tighter, walking slowly toward the source, careful not to let your steps echo too loudly against the worn tiles. Around the next corner, you see 2 guards, young, nervous, pretending to be relaxed, standing a bit too still beside a column. You nod as you pass, and they bow, just enough to acknowledge you, but not enough to suggest deference. They don't stop you, but they watch you go. The dog, you find, is not a large one. A small mutt, likely descended from one of the Manchurian palace breeds, tail curled tightly against its spine, coat the color of roasted chestnuts. It stands at the base of a carved stone dragon, ears alert, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the garden gate. It does not bark again, but its posture suggests that it still senses something. Something you cannot see. Something just out of reach. You take mental note of the dog's position, its direction, its silence. Later, in your chamber, you open your diary and begin the evening's entry with deliberate calm. Tonight, the dog barked near the northern gate. 2 guards were present. Neither moved. You don't speculate yet. Not in the first lines. You've learned to let the details settle before interpretation. Because sometimes the most damning detail is not the noise itself, but the absence of reaction around it. After a few lines describing the shape of the moon, clouded, pale, like worn porcelain, you allow yourself a single observation. No one acknowledged the bark, and that is what worries me. Historians still argue whether palace disturbances followed a pattern, or whether human minds, desperate for order, simply imposed one retroactively. But every eunuch who has lived long enough behind these red walls knows better. Disturbances leave trails. And dogs, unlike men, do not know how to lie with their silence. You recall an older entry, written years ago, the paper slightly yellowed from age and handling, in which a eunuch named Shu described a similar event. The dog barked during the 8th watch. I was delivering ink. A consort cried in her chamber 2 hours later. That night, the wind would not stop. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The implication was there, quiet and chilling. What you've always found fascinating is how often dogs appear in the margins of these diaries. Never central, never explained, always peripheral, and yet unmistakably meaningful. As if they were the unconscious mind of the palace, barking only when something below the surface began to shift. In another diary, long hidden in the floorboards of the archive of ancestral decrees, a eunuch wrote, "We were told the dog barked because of fox spirits, but the next morning, the prince's seal was missing and no one ever found it." He never mentioned the dog again, and so tonight, after recording the dog, you begin a second list, separate from your usual entries, a private ledger titled Disturbances. You mark the date, you describe the sound, the absence of wind, the position of the guards, the fact that the plum blossoms were not fragrant despite the season. You don't know what it all means yet, but you know enough to begin collecting, because this is how trouble announces itself in the Forbidden City. Not with proclamations or bells or raised voices, but with a bark in the dark, a flickering lantern where there should be none, a concubine glancing too often toward a closed door, a note passed without ceremony between two men who refused to meet eyes. The dog barked, and now something is moving. You've never truly liked the imperial kitchens, not because they're unclean or disorganized. Far from it. But because they possess a kind of barely controlled chaos, a rhythm so sharp and precise that it makes the rest of the palace seem slow by comparison. And every time you step past the curtain of bamboo beads and into the steamy, ginger-scented air, you feel as though you've walked not into a workplace, but into the heart of an elaborate performance, one in which timing is everything and mistakes are not corrected. They are replaced. This morning you are sent there on behalf of the palace physician, who has requested that the emperor's porridge be prepared with a specific blend of millet and herbs to soothe an unsettled stomach. Though, if we're being honest, you suspect the real issue was the candied hawthorn slices eaten too late last night, when the emperor insisted, between bouts of laughter, that a little sweetness brings vivid dreams. The physician had not found it amusing. As you make your way past steaming pots and hunched backs stirring with rapid practice circles, you catch a familiar scent, aged tangerine peel, and something in you relaxes. You know this kitchen. You know these people. And they, in turn, know you not as a name or title, but as a regular presence, a pair of quiet eyes who never speaks too loudly and always notices when the oil is too low, the steam too thick, the flavor slightly off. You're not a cook, of course, but you're one of them, a watcher, an archivist of behavior. Today, as the porridge simmers and the head chef whispers, commands with his ladle rather than his voice, you linger near the preparation table, where a small, half-worn piece of parchment lies tucked beside a jar of medicinal roots. It's stained, a little curled at the edge, and your eyes, sharpened by habit, catch the familiar pattern of vertical brush strokes. The handwriting of a eunuch, not recent, but not ancient either. You wait until no one is looking, then slide the paper closer and glance down. It's not a diary page, at least not formally. It's a recipe. Or rather, it appears to be one. For nights when the stomach knots and the breath turns shallow, 3 parts millet, 1 part goji, ginger not more than a whisper, salt like regret. You blink once, slowly, read it again. It's not a recipe, not really. It's a confession disguised as instruction. This isn't the first time you've found fragments like this. Slipped between supply lists, scratched onto the backs of menus, folded into tea boxes, as though their authors couldn't quite bring themselves to keep a diary, but also couldn't let the thoughts vanish completely. They always take the same form: medicinal advice laced with metaphor, recipes seasoned with memory, dosages measured in emotion instead of weight. One especially strange entry, found years ago inside the drawer of a broken spice cabinet, read, "To forget a forbidden name, mint leaves bruised, steeped long, and swallowed cold before dawn." Another, more bitter, "To quiet the heart when she chooses another, boil bitter melon until soft, eat alone, repeat until acceptance or nausea." Historians might call these scribbles irrelevant, superstitions, poetry, palace folklore, but you know better. These were emotional brews, diaries without structure, secret offerings of grief and memory, left behind in a world that asked its keepers to remain neutral, flavorless, like plain broth. You tug the page into your sleeve and return your attention to the porridge, which is just beginning to thicken, the small millet grains spinning in lazy circles as the cook stirs, one hand gripping the wooden spoon with the same casual reverence a monk might show to an incense stick. You observe quietly as he sprinkles crushed perilla leaf across the surface, and you make a note of it. Not in your diary, not yet, but in that quiet catalogue you keep in the back of your mind, where ingredients blur with memory and flavors become markers of time. You remember another moment, years ago, when a porridge was made too thick and the emperor coughed halfway through the first bite. That cook was demoted within the hour. The replacement had served quietly for 3 years before losing favor for forgetting a slice of ginger. You do not believe the food was ever the real reason, which is why the diaries take such care with culinary details, not just as record-keeping, but as witness. You recall one entry where the writer observed, "He eats slower when anxious. Today, it took him 14 spoonfuls before he smiled." Another, "She did not touch the dumplings she had chosen then. I was the last to know." A third, "Today's fish had too many bones. He said nothing, but his mother once died choking." These aren't recipes. They're emotional autopsies performed in real time, flavored by grief, anxiety, and the weight of unspoken understanding. You take the finished bowl, carry it through the corridor with the same solemnity as an offering, and place it gently upon the lacquered tray, meant for the emperor's midday meal. You will not see him eat it. You will not hear what he says about the texture. But you will know, by the way the empty bowl returns, by the absence or presence of a small chip in the rim, by whether the serving girl carries it back with both hands or just one. You will know how it was received. And later, in the hush of your own quarters, you will write. Not just what was served, but what it meant. The porridge was accepted without comment. He's thinking again of someone lost. I could taste it. You won't need to explain. The diary will understand. Historians still argue whether eunuchs played a role in court politics. Some claim You were merely functionaries, neutral and forgettable, while others accuse your kind of pulling strings behind the curtain. But few consider the deeper truth, that you, the watchers, the servers, the cooks, the note-takers, were not simply participants in court life, but its archivists, preserving not only what happened, but how it tasted, how it smelled, how it sat heavy in the stomach of the man who ruled all beneath heaven. You retrieve the parchment from your sleeve, unfold it, and write your own addition on the back in a space left blank. To survive another day, eat plain rice, write 3 truths, and speak none of them. Then you fold it again, slip it behind a jar of dried orange peel, and return to your duties. It starts, as so many things do in this palace, with something missing. Not a person, not a title, but an object, small and seemingly insignificant, and yet wrapped in just enough ritual and personal importance to cause a ripple in the delicate web of routine. It is a jade hairpin, slender, carved in the shape of a lotus bud just beginning to bloom. And when Lady Jin realizes it is no longer in her lacquered comb box, she does not scream or cry or accuse, not immediately, but simply stands, stares into the empty silk lining and whispers. It was placed there last night. You, of course, are summoned, not because you stole it, though in this place, innocence is never presumed, but because you're among the few who know how to investigate without disrupting the surface tension of court life, who can step quietly into rooms that were supposed to remain untouched and ask questions that sound like observations, who understands that solving a mystery in the palace is not about truth, but about timing, and that whoever appears too eager to resolve a matter is always, always suspect. The room is quiet when you arrive. Lady Shin sits upright on her carved rosewood chair, her hands resting in her lap, with the stillness of a painted scroll, but her eyes flick up to meet yours for a moment. Brief, direct, then gone. You bow. She nods. A servant girl shifts uncomfortably behind the screen, pretending to arrange teacups that do not need arranging. You ask no questions at first. Instead, you walk slowly around the room, noting what hasn't been disturbed. The embroidery frame still stretched tight, the incense burner glowing with a steady coil of amber smoke, the teacup stained faintly with osmanthus, set too close to the edge of the table. You murmur, no signs of a struggle, no hinge disturbed. It isn't meant for her, but she nods anyway. Only once do you catch her expression shift. And that's when you pause beside the window and glance at the servant's slippers, which are too clean for someone who claimed to have swept the garden this morning. You don't say anything. Not yet. The palace isn't a place for confrontation. It's a place for quiet accumulation, for letting details pile up like snow until their weight speaks louder than accusation. Later, back in your own quarters, you open your diary and write down the scene. Not the theft itself, but the performance around it. Lady Shin feigned calm too well. Servant too nervous. Hairpin, likely not stolen. Hidden. And beneath that, almost as an afterthought, you add, possibly a test, because you've seen this before. Items lost to measure loyalty, trifles misplaced to smoke out silent alliances. The palace is full of these subtle games, where a single object, a comb, a scroll, a perfume bottle, can become the center of a whispered drama that spreads like spilled ink through the corridors. It's not about the item. It never is. It's about reaction, about observing who shows too much concern or not enough, and drawing conclusions from the tempo of their denial. One of your favorite diaries, written in careful regular script by a eunuch named Bao, who served during the Wanli reign, includes an entire section titled The List of Lost Things, where he records not just the objects, but the patterns behind their disappearances. A hairpin on the night of a demotion, a fan the day before an exile, a shoe that vanished and reappeared 6 days later in another woman's quarters. Bao didn't solve these mysteries, but he didn't need to. His power was in noticing, in laying the dots quietly, patiently, so others could draw the lines if they dared. In your own experience, some of these thefts are real. Acts of petty revenge, of jealousy, of desperation, but others are performances written into the very architecture of palace life. Distractions to mask deeper plots or to test the emotional landscape before something more serious is set in motion. You once uncovered an entire scandal by paying attention to the way one maid folded hand towels in a consort's room. After her mistress claimed a coral earring had been stolen, you noted that the maid, previously fastidious, had begun placing the towels ever so slightly askew. It turned out she had done it on purpose, not out of guilt, but to signal to someone, anyone, that something wasn't right. In today's case, however, it seems less like guilt and more like theater. That evening, as you walk past the garden on your way to deliver a scroll to the Minister of Rights, you pause when you see Lady Shin seated alone on a stone bench, the moonlight casting a soft sheen on her lacquered hair. She doesn't speak when you approach. She doesn't even turn her head. But as you pass, she lifts a single hand, briefly, to adjust the comb in her hair. You see it instantly, the jade hairpin, tucked behind the ear. Not prominently, but clearly, intentionally. And you understand, it wasn't lost. It was never lost. It was a signal. Perhaps to you, perhaps to someone else, but the message is the same. I can control the story. That night, in your diary, you write. The hairpin returned to its proper place. The servant smiled in relief. No punishment given. Lesson planted. Audience uncertain. Historians still argue whether the women of the inner court had agency, or whether they lived entirely under the control of the emperor and his officials. But you've lived among them. You've watched them wield silence like a sword and glances like ropes. You've seen how power in the palace is never just about orders or titles, but about narrative, about who controls what is seen and when. You admire Lady Shin for this. Not because she deceived anyone, though she did, but because she understood the game. Because she played it gently, cleanly, without ruin. And because she let the hairpin reappear just when it needed to, like a secret returning home. You've noticed, haven't you, how quiet things become after a celebration in the palace? Not immediately, of course, for the drums take time to fade, and the scent of roasted duck lingers in the kitchens for hours, even days. But eventually, when the silks are folded away, the banners tucked into their chests, and the jade goblets dried and stored behind their lacquered doors. A hush descends over the corridors, like fine dust. And it's in this hush, in the hours and days after feasts and festivals, that the most curious entries find their way into your diary. Because this is when people let down their guards. Because after you've performed joy long enough, smiled too many times in too few hours, raised too many toasts to people you barely tolerate, bowed too often to someone you fear more than love, your limbs ache from the effort of pretending. And that's when you slip, when the mask tilts just slightly, revealing glimpses of thoughts you would never dare say aloud. And that's when eunuchs like you notice everything. Tonight is just such a night. The Mid-Autumn Festival has concluded, the mooncakes half eaten and boxed in layers of patterned paper, the lanterns extinguished, and their ashes swept into the garden soil. You sit in your quiet chamber with your lamp flickering low, and you write, slowly, deliberately. Post-festival vulnerability. Lady G cried near the magnolia tree. Reason unclear. Possibly wine, possibly loneliness. You're not mocking her. Far from it. You're cataloguing a truth that no official record will note, that the aftermath of celebration often reveals the palace's undercurrent of weariness. Eunuchs weep in the dark over broken instruments. Servants grow sharp-tongued and careless with their gossip. And consorts, who spent the entire night standing upright in heavy robes of embroidered gold, often wake with swollen feet and swollen hearts. In one diary entry, written decades before your time, a eunuch named Liang describes how, after a particularly grand lantern festival, he stumbled upon the empress herself, seated alone on the ground behind the stage. Her ornate headdress removed, her wig lopsided, her feet bare and dusty. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. She simply drew circles in the dirt with one finger, murmuring what he believed were the names of her dead children. No historian will ever publish that, but you will remember it. And tonight, something similar happens. You pass the pavilion of fragrant ink on your way to return a poetry scroll. Normally, this little chamber, used for private calligraphy sessions, is silent and locked. But tonight, you hear soft murmuring from inside. Not conversation, not even crying. Just a single voice, reciting poetry not for an audience but for the walls. You don't knock. That would be cruel. Instead, you sit outside for a moment, leaning your back against the cold tile wall, listening. The voice belongs to an older eunuch, when, if you're not mistaken, someone who rarely speaks, who limps slightly, who keeps to himself. But now, under the veil of post-festival silence, he's reading aloud from a scroll that trembles in his hand. His voice is quiet, steady, and you realize that he's not reciting official verse. These are not imperial poems, not the rigid meter of court-approved literature. They are his own. You hear the words, "I remember my name once sang between rice stalks and laughter." And again, "Now the moon watches me, a stranger in silk." You don't write this in your diary. Not tonight. It feels too raw, too real. But you will, later. You'll record that the eunuchs, too, had their own voices, their own small rebellions, their own attempts to anchor themselves in memory, even as the palace stripped them of everything else. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were complicit oppressors or tragic victims. You find the debate tiresome. The truth as always, is quieter, more complex. They were both, and neither. They were men who survived, who adapted, who laughed and plotted and mourned, who turned memory into poetry and secrets into armor. You think of your own little scrolls, tucked beneath your mattress, filled with lines you dare not share. Not because they're treasonous, but because they're yours. Because to expose your voice is to risk having it mocked, erased, misunderstood. Later that week, you find Wen in the laundry courtyard, folding robes with the precision of a man who finds comfort in routine. You do not mention the poem. You simply nod. He nods back. A moment passes, and then he says, without looking at you, ink stains never leave the skin. You notice that? You do? Your fingers are always a little blackened. So were Liang's and Bao's, and all those who chose to write when they could have simply obeyed. Back in your chamber, you finally jot a line in your diary. Poetry in the ink pavilion, voice trembling but clear. A small act of defiance disguised as rhythm. There are no fireworks in the palace tonight, no music, only the soft rustle of slippers on stone and the occasional hoot of an owl too bold to fear human walls. You imagine the other eunuchs in their private corners, whispering their memories into the night air like incense, not for glory, not for change, but simply to hear themselves again. And that is enough. The rains have arrived. Not the delicate, mist-like showers of early spring, but the deep, steady kind that soaks the eaves of the palace tiles and turns the stone pathways into glistening rivers. The kind of rain that makes the world feel quieter somehow, even though it drums relentlessly against every surface, muffling conversation, drowning out footsteps, and leaving only the hypnotic rhythm of water, steady, insistent, and strangely calming. You walk slower today, not only because the paths are slippery, but because the rain seems to demand it, as though rushing would offend the solemn mood it brings. And in this calmness, you find yourself reflecting on one of the strangest paradoxes of your life in the palace. The contradiction between visibility and invisibility. Because as a eunuch, you are always present, everywhere and nowhere all at once. You are the first to enter the emperor's study in the morning, lighting the lanterns with practiced flicks of the wrist, and the last to leave the ceremonial hall at night, checking for forgotten fans and dropped jade hairpins. You know where every doorway creaks, where each consort prefers her tea to be served, and exactly how many grains of rice the Minister of Rites will leave uneaten at lunch. You are seen, yes, but not truly noticed. Watched, perhaps, but not remembered, except when something goes wrong. Then, suddenly, eyes fall on you, sharp and suspicious. And everyone remembers you were there all along. It's on a rainy morning like this one, with mist creeping through the gaps between the wooden panels and your shoes soaked through by the time you reach the hall of the plum blossom throne, that you notice a commotion not typically allowed this early. 2 guards are standing stiff at the doors, refusing entrance to an elderly eunuch whose hands tremble ever so slightly as he presents a sealed scroll. You know him? Jing, quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who balances calligraphy brushes as if they were made of glass. The guards, unbending, cite orders from a minister you dislike on principle, because his perfume always arrives 5 steps before he does. The scroll in question, you later discover, contains a record of an overheard conversation between 2 junior court musicians, no less, about a visiting envoy who might have offered an inappropriate gift. A porcelain jar with a phoenix motif, perfectly ordinary, but someone interpreted the number of tail feathers as a coded insult. Yes, truly. Jing was doing what eunuchs sometimes did when bored or overly cautious, reporting. Not because he believed anything would come of it, but because that was the dance. You observe, you note, you pass it upwards, and the machinery turns as it wishes. Except this time, it didn't. It ceased. Jing is removed from his post by dusk. No accusations, no punishment, nothing overt, which is somehow worse. Just a gentle repositioning to the lower archives, where mold clings to scrolls and sunlight never visits. You find him later that week, eyes red not from tears, but from reading by poor candlelight. He smiles when he sees you and jokes. At least the rats here respect silence. Historians still argue whether eunuchs had real power, or merely acted as mouthpieces for greater figures. You suppose the answer lies in that damp archive room? You had power, yes, but only so long as someone more powerful found it useful. The moment your usefulness faded or your loyalty was questioned, you became excess. And yet you keep writing. You write about Jing and the phoenix vise. You write about the tension you felt while watching the guards block his way, and the sinking weight in your stomach as you realized this was what palace justice often looked like. Not a dramatic trial or public shame, but a quiet erasure. In another entry, decades old, a eunuch named Han recounts how he witnessed the quiet downfall of a tea steward who had accidentally served bitter leaf to a visiting duchess. The punishment? Not demotion, but reassignment to the stables, forever. The crime? An honest mistake, perhaps, or perhaps a subtle insult interpreted by someone desperate to assert dominance. It all depended on interpretation. So you learn, over time, to be precise with your words, to say just enough, never too much. And in your secret diary, you record the things that should never be said aloud. Not just the gossip or the observations, but your feelings, your genuine frustrations, and your strange little joys, like the way you find comfort in the sound of the rain hitting the bronze drums outside the music hall, or how you noticed the court painter's apprentice accidentally dab a spot of red where blue should have gone, and no one corrected it. So now, one immortal crane forever has a blush on its wing. There is beauty in these errors, and sometimes there is safety in being overlooked. You think about the other eunuchs who came before you, those whose names are only footnotes, whose stories have vanished except for a single dried ink mark on the corner of a page, or a name mentioned in passing in a ledger. But their diaries live on. You've read them. You've memorized certain lines just because they felt like yours. The emperor coughed today, twice, no one dared ask. She looked at me as if she saw a man, not a ghost. The moonlight made the walls seem thin, like rice paper. I wanted to walk through them. Small things, fragile things, real things. You return to your room that night with damp sleeves and a mind full of unfinished thoughts. You light a single candle and begin to write. Not a report, not a notice for the archives, but a letter to no one. To the walls, to the ink, to whatever part of yourself still needs reminding that being invisible does not mean being voiceless. You write, I watched another fall today. I wonder if someone will watch when it's my turn, and then, but I will write until the ink runs dry. Let that be my resistance. You close the diary and blow out the candle. The rain continues, soaking, steady, mercifully indifferent, and in the silence that follows, you feel oddly seen. You wake before the birds. Not because you must, not today, but because the air in your room feels unusually still, as if the palace itself is holding its breath. It's that peculiar pre-dawn hour when even the most diligent servants haven't yet begun their rustling, and the fire braziers are still cold from the night. You lie there a moment, eyes half open, listening not for sound, but for absence, which in this place is often far more revealing. You dress without ceremony, thin robe, soft slippers, the sash tied loosely, and step into the corridor, just as a faint breeze stirs the lanterns. Everything is tinted blue and grey, even the silk of the clouds above the courtyard, and the paving stones are slick with dew. It is in this moment of suspended quiet that you remember something you read long ago, scrawled on the brittle edge of an anonymous eunuch's diary, barely decipherable. The hours before the first bell are the only ones I own. That line has stayed with you, and today, more than most, you feel its truth in your bones, because today is the emperor's birthday, which means everything will be choreographed to the edge of absurdity. Not just the official processions, the rhythmic bowing, the musical performances, or the specially composed poems praising his divine virtue and celestial wisdom. No, what truly exhausts you is the invisible choreography, the constant adjustment of invisible threads. Who walks beside whom in the procession, which concubine gets positioned closer to the emperor's dais, which regional governor's messenger is granted 2 more seconds of eye contact than the others. These details, so small as to be imperceptible to the untrained, are in fact weighted with consequence. And you, as always, are expected to see them, record them, and act accordingly. But before all of that begins, before the drums sound and the cooks panic and the hairdressers weep into their pins, you choose to spend a brief hour in the hall of peaceful records. Not to read official documents, but to visit the hidden alcove where the old diaries are kept. The real ones. The ones never intended for imperial eyes. You run your fingers over the spine of one you've come to know by heart. It is unsigned, undated, but the entries inside have a distinctive voice. Wry, precise, not bitter, but certainly resigned. One passage in particular draws you in this morning. On the emperor's birthday, we celebrate not his birth, but the ritual of being near him without becoming too noticeable. To be seen without being remembered. That is the true art. You close the book and smile faintly, because you know exactly what that eunuch meant. Later, as the sun rises and the palace erupts into motion, you are pulled into the current. There are lists to double-check, sashes to smooth, ceremonial objects to inspect, each one encoded with meaning. A jade rui's scepter, placed on the wrong side of the throne, might be interpreted as an omen. A robe creased along the wrong fold could draw the ire of the Grand Chamberlain. You move among these hazards like a fish in turbulent water. Practiced, efficient, unnoticed. You deliver a scroll to the calligraphy master's apprentice, who is trembling because he forgot to include the proper flourish on the final character of the emperor's name. You reassure him in a whisper, he won't read it. Which is true. But the ministers will. And that's what matters. During the formal ceremony, you're stationed just behind the third pillar on the eastern side of the hall, close enough to observe, far enough to be invisible. From there, you watch as the emperor receives tribute after tribute. Exotic fruits, golden figurines, folded scrolls with praises so flowery they could wilt a garden. His expression never changes. You wonder, sometimes, if he even hears what's being said, or if he, like you, is simply performing a role so deeply embedded in the machinery of the court that he no longer questions it. You remember a diary from the Yongle period in which a eunuch describes how the emperor smiled once, only once, during his entire birthday celebration? When a small boy, part of a dance troupe, tripped and fell, and then promptly bowed in apology. That one unscripted moment, the diary notes, was the only one that felt real. There are no such moments today. Everything goes precisely as planned. And for that, everyone is grateful. But as the sun begins to lower and the festivities fade into the more intimate evening banquet, you feel a hollowness settle over the palace like mist. You write later that night. Today we celebrated the idea of a man, not the man himself, because you've seen the emperor up close. You've stood silently by while he muttered under his breath about a splinter in his thumb. You fetched medicine for his headaches and watched him scowl at his own reflection in the polished mirror. He's human, yes, but not today. Today, he's a myth in flesh, and everyone around him, yourself included, plays their part in maintaining that illusion. And perhaps the strangest part of it all is that you don't resent it. Not exactly, because you understand the comfort of routine, of roles so clearly defined that you never have to question your purpose. There is peace in repetition, even when it's absurd. Still, as you sit by the window of your quarters that night, watching the last of the lanterns being extinguished one by one, you feel a strange kinship with the eunuch who once wrote, "I would like to be remembered, not for what I served, but for how I watched." You decide to leave your own trace tonight, just a short entry, not a complaint, not a revelation, just a small truth. I smiled today when I saw a flower petal land on the emperor's sleeve, and no one dared remove it. It stayed there, like a second badge of office, until the wind took it away. And then you sleep, knowing that tomorrow the palace will forget everything that happened today, except the parts that were recorded officially. But you'll remember the petal. There's a certain time of year, late autumn, just as the last chrysanthemums begin to droop in their lacquered pots, when the palace slips into a rhythm unlike any other, quieter than spring, duller than the height of summer festivals, and less frantic than the New Year preparations. It is the season of the census, of accountancy, of lists and scrolls and tallies, when the emperor's ministers demand updated inventories of everything from palace robes to goose feathers used in fans, And every department, yes, including yours, must submit records with the kind of detail that would bore even the most dedicated scholar. But you don't find it boring. You find it soothing. There's something oddly comforting about the repetition. Counting inkstones, verifying brush counts, making sure each robe has its matching sash, checking each jar of medicinal paste for cracks or leaks. These are the kinds of tasks that make your mind drift in soft, harmless directions. You become a machine, almost, folding, stacking, checking, noting. No politics, no poetry, no punishment, just numbers and parchment, and the quiet squeak of your brush as it scratches each tally mark onto the page. Today, you're assigned to assist in the inventory of the Imperial Library's auxiliary annex. Not the grand hall of collected fragrance, but a smaller, dustier room where rejected or duplicated scrolls are stored. It's where old calendars go to die, and where obsolete reports, abandoned edicts, and half-finished philosophical treatises are stacked in crooked rows that lean like tired old men. And it is here that you make a discovery. Buried beneath a box of cracked bamboo slats and a moth-eaten ledger of ceremonial gift exchanges is a bundle of scrolls wrapped in faded blue silk, tied with a fraying cord. There's no label, no tag, just a small stitched symbol on the corner of the wrapping, an eye, half closed. You take them home. You know, of course, that this is forbidden. You are not to remove texts from the archives, even those deemed irrelevant. But the quiet beckoning of that bundle, it feels personal, like it was waiting. So that night, under the weak light of your paper lantern, you untie the cord with careful fingers and unroll the first scroll, and you freeze. The handwriting is familiar. Not personally, but stylistically. The same neat vertical flow you've seen in older eunuch diaries. But this one is different. It's not a diary. It's a manual, titled Only for Those Who Remain. It appears to be a collection of observations, instructions, and reflections meant not for posterity, but for other eunuchs. A sort of whispered guidebook passed from one invisible hand to the next. It is not signed, but the tone is unmistakable, dry, incisive, and tinged with a wisdom earned only through long silence. One passage reads, "You are not a shadow. You are a mirror. Your presence reflects the room back at itself. If they laugh, you must smile. If they shout, you must bow. If they cry, you must look away. They will say this is loyalty. You will know it is survival." Another, more practical, "Never trust a minister who flatters the cooks. Never cross the courtyard during pigeon hour. Never, under any circumstance, correct a concubine's poetry, even if it's terrible." You chuckle quietly at that one, because you've made that mistake once, just once. The scrolls continue. Stories interspersed with advice, parables with no clear morals, and odd aphorisms that feel plucked from a half-forgotten dream. There's a section on how to fake a convincing limp to avoid being reassigned to heavy lifting duties. A treatise on the difference between genuine kindness and dangerous attention. A long, meandering passage about the best hiding places in each wing of the palace for a moment of peace. The lacquer box behind the incense storeroom, the sunken alcove near the third arch of the northern garden wall, the hollow beneath the statue of the horse with the chipped ear You find yourself copying these places into your own diary. And then, at the very end of the final scroll, a short note. If you're reading this, you have survived more than most. Remember that no one will ever reward your vigilance. No one will thank you for holding your tongue. But still, you do it. Because silence in this place is the truest kind of strength. You sit there for a long time, unmoving, as the lantern sputters and the shadows shift around you. You've always believed you were alone in this, that your observations, your rituals, your habits were yours alone. But now you see you're part of a lineage. Not a noble one, not one etched into tablets or sung about by storytellers, but a lineage nonetheless. A quiet, ink-stained brotherhood. Historians still debate whether eunuchs truly left behind meaningful legacies, since so few of their writings were preserved in official archives. But they're wrong, you realize. The legacies weren't meant for historians. They were meant for each other. For you. The next morning, you return the bundle to its resting place beneath the bamboo slats, careful to wrap it in the exact same folds. You do not sign your name. You do not leave a mark. But you do add a single line on a thin slip of parchment and tuck it inside. Still here, still watching, still writing. Later that week, when the census is complete and the palace returns to its usual rhythms of ceremony and scandal, no one mentions the auxiliary annex. No one knows what you found, but you do. And you carry it with you now, an invisible inheritance, like an extra layer of skin. That evening, as the sun sets behind the western wall, casting gold light across the corridor, you pass a younger eunuch, struggling to carry a stack of robes twice his height. He bows clumsily. You stop. You offer to help. He hesitates, then nods. As you walk beside him, you whisper, without looking, "Avoid the incense storeroom when the third bell rings. Too many eyes." He glances at you, curious, grateful. And just like that, the lineage continues. The winter wind returns with sharpness this year. Not the dull, muffled kind that clings to sleeves and creeps under doors like a polite guest, but a bolder, slicing wind that whistles through the lattice windows, lifts roof tiles at the edges, and reminds every living soul in the Forbidden City that time continues to move forward, regardless of whose name is written in gold on the throne. You pull your robe tighter around your body as you cross the courtyard before dawn, the sound of your own footsteps unusually crisp in the brittle air. And with every breath, you exhale a pale ghost of warmth that vanishes almost as quickly as it appears. Winter in the palace brings with it a different texture of silence, denser, heavier, more final somehow. The ponds are covered in thin ice that crackles at the edges but holds in the center. The pines stand rigid, as if listening for secrets frozen into the air. And the eunuchs, like everything else, move more slowly now, bundled and quiet. Their voices lower, their tasks somehow softer, as though they, too, feel the weight of the season's hush. Today you are assigned a rare task, to accompany the imperial seal to a small, private ceremony. It is not a public event, not a grand ritual filled with drums and bowed heads, but something quieter, almost domestic. The emperor is granting a rare audience to a Buddhist monk who has traveled hundreds of li from the western provinces, bringing with him a scroll of ancient verses believed to be transcribed in a script now almost forgotten. The monk is old, shaven-headed, with eyes like carved walnut, and hands that seem to float rather than move. He says little. The emperor, even less. You are not meant to listen. You are meant to hold the seal in its case of red lacquer and gold hinges, and to hand it over only when summoned. But of course you listen, because this is what you've always done. The monk speaks slowly, his voice like dry paper against stone. And what you gather, though much is metaphor and much is lost between dialects, is that he is here to remind the emperor of something ancient, something spiritual, something that existed long before bureaucrats drew borders or court poets bent metaphors into riddles. The emperor nods, once, then twice, and signs a decree that will never be read aloud in court, but will ripple silently through the palace like incense through silk. After the monk is led away, the emperor lingers, holding the decree in his hands, as if unsure whether to keep it or let it burn. You are still holding the now unneeded seal, and though you remain still, your gaze gently fixed downward, your thoughts drift. You remember a diary entry written centuries ago, found in a cracked bamboo cylinder, in a wall niche no one was supposed to know about. The eunuch who wrote it had served 3 emperors. He had seen dynasties tighten like fists and then shatter like porcelain. And in one quiet passage he wrote, "The throne is not a man, it is a weather pattern. Stand still long enough, and you will see it change." You did not understand it then. But now, watching your emperor hesitate in the fading light of a quiet winter morning, you begin to. There is something else you've noticed in recent months, something subtle, but present nonetheless. A small but growing habit among the younger eunuchs. They've started writing. Not official logs, not imperial reports, but real writing. Little scraps tucked between floorboards. Smudged characters scribbled into the margins of unused ledgers. Notes passed quietly in the laundry quarters. They've begun telling their stories. You are not their teacher. You've never claimed that. But they come to you now, sometimes pretending it's to borrow a brush or ask about ink mixes. But you know? And sometimes one of them will say something strange and simple, like, "No. Do you think anyone will read it after I'm gone?" You always answer the same way. "That's not why you write." Because it isn't. Not truly. You don't write to be remembered. You write because otherwise everything slips away. The days, the faces, the small humiliations, the quiet victories, the sound of rain in the calligraphy hall, the exact way the emperor folds his sleeves when bored. All of it will vanish, unless it is pinned to paper, even if the paper yellows and fades and crumbles into dust. You write because it is your only act of defiance and your only act of devotion. That night, back in your room, you open your diary to a fresh page. You've just sharpened your brush. The ink is smooth, freshly ground. You pause before you begin, the silence pressing close like a heavy blanket. And then, slowly, deliberately, you write. There is power in holding the seal, but more power in watching what happens after it is used. You pause. The wind taps at your window. I do not serve only the emperor. I serve the memory of this place. I serve the story of those who are never mentioned. And finally, if I am lucky, someone will find this and think, he saw everything. You close the diary. You press your palm to its cover. The room is cold, but your heart is strangely warm. Not from pride, not from ambition, but from continuity. Because tomorrow, someone else will write. And one day, perhaps long after you're gone, the story of the palace will no longer belong to those who ruled it, but to those who watched and remembered and never stopped writing. You wake earlier than usual today, though the palace is still shrouded in the gentle darkness of the pre-dawn hour. The air is crisp, motionless, as if the entire forbidden city is holding its breath, suspended between night and morning. The stone beneath your feet feels colder than usual, but you don't mind. You've come to appreciate the way the early hours grant you something rare in a world of constant duty. Silence that belongs entirely to you. There is a small ritual you've developed over the years, unspoken and unnoticed, like most of your routines. Before beginning your official duties, you walk slowly along the long covered corridor behind the hall of literary glory, a part of the palace rarely used now, its paint shipped in quiet places, its columns slightly bowed from time and weather. You touch each supporting beam with your fingers as you pass, as though greeting old friends. A small nod to continuity, a tiny act of devotion. The younger eunuchs would probably find it odd. They are full of questions these days, always watching you with that particular look, half reverence, half curiosity. You've become somehow the one they turn to when they are lost, when they've misplaced a document, or misunderstood a command, or simply don't know what to feel. You don't tell them what to think. You only listen. And when they leave, they often thank you more than they should. This morning, one of them is waiting at your door. His name is Lin. He's slight, quiet, but with a sharpness in his eyes that reminds you of a blade kept deliberately dull for too long. He holds a folded page in his hand, yellowed at the corners, trembling slightly. He says nothing, only offers it to you. You take it, unfold it slowly, and recognize the characters immediately. It's a diary entry. Not yours, not even his. It's one of the old ones, copied by hand. A fragment of a forgotten eunuch's thoughts from a dynasty 3 reigns past. The script is hesitant, uneven, but the words still breathe. I write in secret, not because I wish to defy, but because I refuse to disappear. You look up. Lin watches you carefully, awaiting a response he cannot quite name. You hand the paper back, and you nod. Later that day, the emperor's advisors discuss a new foreign envoy arriving from the west. There's talk of gifts, strange instruments, a ticking machine, a telescope carved from brass. None of it particularly interests you, though you note the eagerness with which the court ministers fawn over these novelties, as though they might prove their modernity through appreciation alone. But what does catch your attention is a comment made offhandedly by one of the chamberlains. He says that eunuchs in some foreign courts were banned entirely from administrative positions, viewed as meddling relics of an archaic world. There is some laughter. The emperor does not laugh. He simply raises a hand and the room falls quiet. Then, without looking at anyone in particular, he says, "Those who observe most often understand best." No one speaks for a long moment after that. You smile, but only inwardly, because you know, now more than ever, that your role was never just about servitude. It was about bearing witness, about becoming a vessel that quietly holds the truth of what happened here, long after everyone else has gone. That evening, the diaries come out again. The other eunuchs have begun writing openly now, still in private corners, still cautiously, but they no longer burn their pages afterward. There's a sense among your circle that these writings are more than records. They are offerings, lanterns lit in a darkened corridor. And the tone is shifting too. Less fear, more reflection, less mourning, more understanding. You sit at your small desk, the ink grinding slowly in its shallow dish, and you begin your final entry for the month. The brush feels worn, but familiar in your fingers. The paper rustles like dry silk beneath your hand. And the words come steadily, with no hesitation. We were never supposed to be the storytellers, but we are. Because no one else stayed long enough to tell the truth, gently. The palace outside is glowing in the amber light of dusk, lanterns flickering to life, one by one, across the eaves and courtyards. Somewhere, incense is burning. Somewhere, someone is laughing softly, probably in the kitchens. And somewhere, another eunuch is picking up a brush, perhaps Lynn, perhaps someone yet unnamed. You close the diary. You rise, and you whisper, just loud enough for the stillness to hear. Let it all be remembered, not for glory, but for truth. Because in the end, it wasn't the emperors or generals who preserved this world. It was you. It was always you. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the last candlelight dances against the wooden beams of your memory, you let your breath slow, sinking deeper into the warmth of the quiet that surrounds you. The palace, once filled with the rustling of robes and whispered secrets, fades into stillness. Its courtyards tucked gently under the blanket of night. Its scrolls closed and ink pots dry. The voices of the eunuchs, those soft chroniclers of forgotten truths, dissolve into the hush, their brushes laid to rest, their thoughts now scattered like petals upon parchment, each one a testament to presence, to care, to enduring dignity in the face of invisibility. You no longer need to recall every detail, the smell of winter ink, the crackle of old paper, the rhythmic sweep of the brush, because it has all been written somewhere, in some forgotten hand, for someone to find someday, far from now. You're safe now. The stories are safe. Let your body grow heavy against the bed. Your limbs sinking like warm silk into still waters. And your breath matching the pace of the lanterns, flickering low across the tiled rooftops of a city that still dreams in silence. The wind has quieted. The ink has dried. And the diary has closed for the night. Sleep now. You've remembered enough for today. End of script. Sweet dreams.